City Matters.
This is Jonny Daniels here at HMTV, and today I have the incredible opportunity to be in conversation with the most remarkable lady, Mrs. Mireille Taub. Thank you so much for being with me here today.
My pleasure.
Now, you know, today's not an easy day.
No, I know.
And I woke up this morning and I was thinking about our conversation a lot. And obviously with the terrible news from Israel, on one hand I thought, you know, maybe we should push this off to another time. But then thinking about it more and more, I realized how important conversations are like this, especially on days like today.
I agree.
Because stories like yours, through the difficulty, bring hope. Now, let's get into a little bit of your story. Maybe you're able to tell us where you were born.
I was born in Paris in 1938. My parents were from Poland originally, but they each emigrated to Paris separately as teenagers and met and married in Paris, and had a very happy life there.
How wonderful. Why did your parents move from Poland to Paris? What was the...
My father was orphaned at 13 and had gone to Warsaw to live with an older sister and realized there was no future for him in Warsaw. So he saved his pennies and he came into France on a visitor's visa and overstayed his visa, was an illegal immigrant. He traveled with the crops in Brittany until he could learn to speak French fluently, which he did, and decided farming life was not for him, and went back to Paris and became involved with what had been one of the family businesses back in Poland, and he became a skilled leather worker.
Oh, wow.
My mother's family was from an upper middle class family in Warsaw, and again, because of the economic structure of post-war Poland, Grandma decided there was no future for them economically, as comfortable as they were in Poland, and she already had family in Paris. I don't know for how long, but they decided to emigrate to France. It was the country of immigration. And Mom came to France maybe when she was 13 or 14 and finished her education in France. So, and I spoke French fluently.
Wow. So you had this kind of Parisian upbringing then? Like
Not
the
quite,
first
at
few
2 years old, no. But they were very Parisian.
Oh, your parents were very Parisian?
Yeah, very much so.
How did your mother dress? With all the fancy Parisian
My
clothing?
mother sort of resembled a cross between Yvonne de Carlo and Josephine Baker.
Wow.
She was a singer. She had voice lessons in Warsaw. And I'm quite sure she did not continue them in Paris, but she had that kind of background, and she was very, very beautiful.
Wow. Do you remember her singing to you?
Oh, always.
Always. What was the song that she sang?
She sang
to you?
opera.
Oh, yeah.
She sang popular music. She sang popular music from France, from America. She loved to sing. She was quite an interesting lady. She was very proper. As a teenager, I used to call her a white glove lady because everything had to be just right. Oh. And I was anything but as a teenager.
As all teenage girls are, hey?
She was a wonderful role model. And Dad was very understanding of my being somewhat erratic.
Wow. So you're born into this family where middle class, presumably by that point.
Yes.
Life looks like it's normal and everything's fine. They've escaped from the difficult times in Poland to get themselves out to Paris. And then you're 2 years old.
Well, I had an older sister. And Grandma had family in France, as she had sisters there. So it was a close family life, both from my maternal side. And my father invited some cousins who were also struggling in Poland to come to Paris because Paris could offer a better life.
Yeah.
So there was family.
Did you have a particularly Jewish life, or would you say?
I would say they were fairly assimilated. Culturally, definitely Jewish. Practicing, observant to a lesser extent. But many, many years later, when I went back to Paris to live, and I attended services at my in-laws' synagogue, my father said, well, we attended the same synagogue, so obviously they did attend services.
Wow, that's interesting. And so you're a young girl, and then the world comes crashing down.
Well, my grandmother was a very wise woman, and when she realized what was happening in Germany and she felt that it would happen and spread, she turned to my father and said, you have family in America and I have family in America. Let's write to our families and see what can be done in terms of the paperwork that was necessary to get out of France. Dad's family came through first, and my father's cousin Charlie, who had a lot of connections, had become very wealthy, was living in Chicago, managed to get the proper paperwork for the four of us. That was a bit of a problem because my mother became a French national. Very difficult. I'm sure there was bribery involved. Mm-hmm. My sister and I were declared to be French nationals at the local mairie, the village hall. My dad, having been an illegal immigrant, was never able to become a French national because Poland did not recognize his French birth certificate. So cousin Charlie, I don't know how he managed, obtained a Nansen passport for my father, which was issued by the League of Nations for people who were stateless.
Wow.
And Dad had spent the early part of his life in Russia, not Poland, and he was considered to be a white Russian having fled the Russian Revolution. A little complicated.
Goodness, yeah.
But he had one of the 2,000 Nansen passports issued by the League of Nations.
Wow.
And Charlie was forever grateful to Charlie.
Unbelievable. So you were able to leave at that point?
Well, when the war broke out, we were on vacation with the entire extended family.
Where?
In Fontainebleau. All the aunts, uncles, cousins, grandma, grandpa were there, and everybody rushed back to Paris, 1939, August 31st, 1939.
So you're obviously too young to remember that.
I don't remember anything of what occurred. My first memories start after we arrived in the United States.
But you obviously asked the questions. I mean, what?
I was a questioning kind of kid.
Wow.
And my bedroom was off the kitchen, and my parents would talk with cousins, American cousins at that point, in French, in Yiddish, in English, and I understood all of that. When they got to the Polish, I turned off. But the next morning I would say, what was all the yelling and screaming about? And Dad would answer all my questions. So,
Dad would answer all your questions?
As much as he thought I could understand.
Wow.
So, good daddy.
Wow. What was his name?
Well, it depended on what country.
Okay.
His given name at birth was Shlomo. When he arrived in France, he changed it to Sylvain. When he arrived in the United States, he changed it to Sydney. And I think of it as a metaphor for his adaptability and being able to live in the country where he was currently situated.
Wow.
So,
That's an interesting way to look at it. So the family, you're on vacation, the whole extended family.
and we come back to Paris, and my dad signs up to join the army.
Wow.
And he's at first told, not now, you're an older man, you have family.
How old was he at that point?
About 28, I think.
Okay.
27, 28.
But he wanted to fight for France.
He wanted to fight for France because France had given him a very good life. And so he was not quite turned down, but they said, wait, and don't worry, France will win the war. And when the war, which was initially a phony war, became a hot war and became worse, he was called up at the end of May. And he went to his commanding officer and he says, I have all the requisite papers to leave the country. I even he had planned an escape route, which way we should go out.
Wow.
And he said, I'm Jewish and I have a family. And the commanding officer dismissed him. He had told my mother to pack a small suitcase, and we were taking the train from Paris to Bordeaux. I'm not sure why that was the route, but I guess he couldn't get to Switzerland. I really don't know. I never asked him that. But the train was bombed prior to getting to Bordeaux, so we got off the train, and I have the shoes that we walked.
Wow.
And they're run down. I have.
So those are
my baby shoes.
Wow.
I still love shoes.
Yeah. These are fancy baby shoes. They made them different. I
was a very well dressed kid.
Oh, I can see just by the shoes. How wonderful.
And my mother packed this. And originally it was my dad's tobacco kit because he rolled his own cigarettes.
Yeah.
But Mom's family were the original costume makers for the Jewish theater in Warsaw. And Mom had been taught to sew. So this was her sewing kit because with two children and a husband, buttons would fall off, socks would need to be darned. And so this was her repair kit.
So all the way from Platz Jabowski in Warsaw, for the area of the Jewish theater,
Right.
to Paris, to the trains of Bordeaux. Now, so even when we jump back to that for a second, so Mum has to pack a small suitcase.
This size. And we had the suitcase till somewhere in my college days. I remember seeing it in the basement.
Was the thought process that this is it?
Yes. Oh, definitely. Absolutely. We had to get out of the country.
But we're never coming back. So what we're taking out is what we're taking
Right.
out.
And when she left, she wrote to her, she called her brother Leon, Uncle Leon, and she said, take certain things out of the apartment. And he did. He went for some letters and photographs. I have many pre-war photographs. I guess some wedding gifts that were important to her.
And Uncle Leon saved that.
And Uncle Leon either mailed it to us in the United States prior to America entering the war, or schlepped it with him literally as he later escaped from occupied France into unoccupied France and then to Casablanca. In 1942, my dad went to Washington, D.C. for a special hearing because Cousin Charlie had managed to get papers for the rest of the family. So there was a hearing that my grandmother, her husband, Uncle Leon, my Aunt Jeanette, my father's sister, her husband, Uncle Henry, and my cousin Marcel, all met on the ship leaving from Casablanca. Wow. And they came to the United States in 1942 in the middle of the war.
So what was this special hearing that your father went to?
They were taking out enemy aliens from North Africa, was under German control at that point. So they were enemy aliens and they had to be vouchsafed. So the judge, my dad went to D.C. with Cousin Charlie's brother, who was an English professor at the University of Chicago. And when the judge, he was going to be the translator, and when the judge realized that my father spoke English well enough to be able to manage, he says, dismissed, and continued the conversation with my father. And Dad was able to get them out.
Wow.
But going back to our exodus, that train that was bombed was heading towards Bordeaux, and we started to walk to Bordeaux. And we were blocked because the French government had gone to Bordeaux to figure out how to surrender. So we were blocked in a small city about 20, 30 miles from Bordeaux. And hundreds and thousands of refugees on the road milling around. And by coincidence, my father met the American consulate officer who had arranged for our papers. And she recognized my father because his papers were so unusual. She needed to get from Bordeaux across France to Marseille, where the American government was setting up a consulate, and she offered my father a ride. Dad provided the expertise, the language. He probably paid her a little bit, I'm quite sure, but under the circumstances, whatever he may have was worth it.
Absolutely.
And we traveled through the Pyrenees, and she dropped us off in Perpignan. And she went on to Marseille, and we crossed the border from Perpignan to Spain. We were not allowed to get off the train in Spain. Franco took a transit tax, but he didn't want refugees. Then we got to Portugal, and my father booked a passage on a Greek freighter that was part of a convoy that was crossing the North Atlantic. They crossed in the convoy because of German submarines. And 3 months later, we arrived at Ellis Island.
Wow.
So from probably the first week of June till August 11th was our voyage.
Goodness, that's quite the story.
Yeah.
Now, I see, in addition to the gorgeous little shoes, you also have a yellow star with juif, the French for the word Jew.
Yes. I was told that the Jewish Star of Identification with the word Jew is written in the language of the country that was being occupied. This is Uncle Leon's Star of David. Wow. And Uncle Leon had an interesting story. He was young, and he was handsome, and he was flirtatious. And he was online waiting to buy food. Everything was rationed under the occupation and prior to the occupation, but of course under the occupation. And he was flirting with the person behind him, a young woman. And when he placed his order, the person who was serving him said, "This is the last of whatever it was he wanted." And the woman behind him said, "Oh, I wish I had that. I needed it for my father, my uncle, whatever." And Uncle Leon turned around and he said, "Pour vous, mademoiselle," and he gave her whatever he had requested. Several days after that, he was caught in a roundup and brought to the police station, and the secretary in the police station was the young woman with whom he'd been flirting. And she looked at him and recognized him, and she managed to convey to him that this was a transport that would be sent east. And Uncle Leon knew what that meant.
Right.
And she said, "I can wiggle you out of here." And she managed to wiggle him away from the convoy. I am not sure how he got out of occupied France into unoccupied France, but from there he went to North Africa, to Casablanca. But he brought this along with him. And so this is Uncle Leon's Star of David that he wore in the occupation.
That's amazing. How did it end up with you?
After he passed away, his wife gave me certain things that...
Wow. Well, how does that make you feel?
The keeper of history, stories that I have to share. I've always known who I was and what my background was. I'm a retired teacher, and I've brought my experience into my middle school classrooms. And I just feel that it's so important to be able to connect to the past so that we know what the present is and hopefully a better future. So very important to me.
It really is important. You know, we speak, especially in context of Holocaust education often, of, you know, this hope of never again.
Yes.
When you see everything that's happened over the last 15 months and the tragedies of October 7th. And
I have been in personal distress for many, many months. And having always been an activist, this is who I am, this is how I was brought up to be. Part of my distress is not only the events that are occurring, but how do I deal with it on a personal level? And I'm still trying to deal with it. It's fine to write letters, and I do. It's the people who represent me, my elected officials, all happen to feel the same way I do. So my question to myself is, what do I do next? Part of what I do next is to continue to tell my stories.
right.
It can happen. It may happen. Let us prevent it from happening.
So this difficulty that you're feeling is based on a feeling of what you could do more as opposed to anything else.
Absolutely. But feeling semi-helpless, I don't think of myself as a helpless person. But what concrete steps can I take besides voting, obviously, etc.?
Right. You know, it's very interesting. Just last week I was in San Diego and I had the incredible opportunity to sit down with Dr. Edith Eger, who's a Holocaust survivor and a psychologist. She famously wrote the book The Choice, a well-known international book, and is an acclaimed thinker and survivor of Auschwitz and other places, a remarkable woman. And I asked her, you know, what's the most important thing in life? And she said, to be useful.
Yes. I would definitely agree with that.
And it seems that even in context of today, the idea of being useful, and from your perspective, that's telling your story and making sure that people don't forget.
Yes. There's another aspect to my story that's very much a part of me. So I will give you a little information about that. My husband was a hidden child in France.
Wow.
And he called his story The Kindness of Strangers. His mother was extremely outspoken, and whenever they got into a situation which would be challenging because of the times that it occurred in, she would reach out and be quite frank after judging someone's character and saying, I need help, I'm Jewish.
Wow.
And both he, his parents, and his older brother all survived in different places in France because of the kindness of strangers. So standing up and telling people who you are, being proud of who you are, is very significant.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because sometimes we have the intuition in such scenarios to hide ourselves a little bit, to attempt to blend in or or put our Star of David under our shirt, or take off our yarmulke, whatever it may be, to not be so proud. And you're saying the opposite.
I am what I am. I'm not Popeye the Sailor Man, but I am what I am.
Right. And within that, pride becomes a level of respect, right? Like,
absolutely. I have to respect myself, and I expect and hope other people will respect me as I do them.
Wow.
By example.
Because your father's story is interesting, because in one way, obviously, the message is standing tall and standing proud, but it's also the reliance upon strangers, because, today especially can feel like a very lonely time for a lot of Jewish people.
Yes.
Right? We look around and it's, where are all these allies? Right?
They're out there. I live in a multicultural, diverse community. And when Israel was attacked on October 7th, I live in an apartment building. And there were people in my building who came over to me and say, I stand with you, in words to that effect. I hardly knew them. Wow. I know my neighbors. I say hello and I smile. But when they made a point of saying something to me, I was extremely touched.
Right. On the way here, I received a phone call from a friend of mine, a non-Jewish couple, wonderful, wonderful couple, who took October 7th very hard, and they have young children, and they'd become very connected to the story of the Bibas family, those beautiful red-headed children.
Oh, yes.
And one of their daughters is just 6 years old. And she'd heard her parents talking about the Bibas kids all the time. And to the point where one day they caught the 6-year-old putting on a backpack and putting stuff in her backpack and heading towards the front door. And they said, well, where are you going? She said, I'm going to get the children from the bad guys. I'm going to protect them and bring them home.
An upstander.
An upstander. And she called me this morning and said, Jonny, what do I tell my daughter? How do I explain to her that they aren't coming home? And these are difficult questions.
Very. Somewhere in a child's growth to maturity, part of that is learning to deal with the hard stuff in life. Part of that is how your parents help you through that. So hopefully they'll find the strength and courage to be able to talk to her in a way that she will understand. Growing up, I heard my parents talk about, I knew there was a war on. I could understand a certain amount of things. After the war ended, not quite the war, probably after VE Day or somewhere in that time frame, my father was making packages bought with rations and some bought without rations for family in France. He was sending it through CARE. And I said, what are you doing? I must have been about 6.5 at the time. And he explained he was sending it to family. Actually, it was my husband's family he was sending it to. Wow. And I said, why? He said, well, you know that they don't have enough food. So I was very much aware of the conditions. I remember coming home from school and my mother was crying, and parents are not supposed to cry, especially my mother. She was a strong lady.
With her white gloves.
Well, not quite, but she was in the kitchen crying.
Right.
And she was holding a letter from the Red Cross, and I knew what it was because I saw the Red Cross symbol on the letter. So, why are you crying, Mommy? And she told me what was in the letter, and it was explaining how either one of her sisters in Poland, who had never left Poland, or her other sister in France, had died during the war. Wow. And so even as a very young child, I understood as much as a young child can.
So your parents didn't kind of coddle you and hide the truth from you, but...
They were very frank. They told me in the limitations of who I was. I was a bright little girl.
Right, of course.
And I was aware of our own background too, and learned more. As the more questions I asked, the more I learned. I had a wonderful upbringing, so good stuff, and
Wow.
and lucky stuff.
Seriously lucky stuff. What we're going to do now is we're going to pause this part of the thing and jump for a quick break, and we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about